Hello and welcome to the Safer Spotlight podcast, a podcast discussing all things safeguarding and how we can together help to make our churches safer spaces. This podcast is brought to you by the London District of the Methodist Church and the London Learning Network. We hope that this podcast challenges you and inspires you of how we can all play our part in helping to make churches safer spaces. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first week of the podcast. My name is James, and I'm the Regional Coordinator for the Learning Network in London, and I'm joined by Becky.
Hi, James. I'm the District Safeguarding Officer. Woo, thanks for dragging me in.
Always a pleasure, never a chore. And so we are both going to take you on the journey as we look at this podcast. This is the first one of many. And the point of this podcast is Becky and I will kind of drill a bit deeper into a variety of different safeguarding topics, and with the idea of thinking how do these topics, how can we have safer churches, create safer spaces, and make sure that we are ensuring that we're producing best practice in some of these areas. And so our first week, Becky, what is the topic that we're drilling into today?
Well, as we have just left Christmas, we are going to be looking at alcohol. And of course, people's consumption rises over Christmas. So I think it's a very apt theme. And of course, it's dry January as well. So we're looking at alcohol and how that impacts safeguarding.
And in terms of alcohol and safeguarding, why do we need to think about it? Like, what are some of the safeguarding concerns, the links to safeguarding with a topic of such as alcohol?
So I think in today's society, we have alcohol is a huge part of a lot of people's lives. And quite often people can be praised on the amount they drink. So, you drink a lot more than I do, so you're amazing for being able to consume that amount of alcohol. And of course, alcohol, it does have its positive aspects, I guess, in terms of that it can help reduce anxiety. And there's probably quite a few people out there, it's not uncommon to perhaps have a glass of wine or two in the evening to help you unwind and relax. But there is a flip side to that. So what's actually happening when you're consuming alcohol is it's a chemical change in the brain. And so it suppresses brain activity. And that really limits our ability to be able to read social cues or perhaps environmental clues that are going on around. And any warning signals that we'd normally get as a sober person, they would be really unlikely to actually kick in place. And so, of course, that then places us at risk ourselves, or perhaps puts us in confrontational or dangerous situations.
And we kind of, I suppose, anyone can be affected by some of the issues surrounding alcohol. You've got sort of some vulnerable adults, but you've also got families and children. Maybe are you okay to maybe just give a bit of I suppose, a snapshot into maybe some of the safeguarding concerns that we might, for example, find in our churches in relation to, say, to alcohol use?
Okay. So, I mean, when we think about our vulnerable adults, typically as people get older, they tend to drink less, but the alcohol has a much more deeper impact, even though you're actually drinking less. And in terms of what those impacts might look like, there's quite a long, lengthy list. Just to try and sort of pick out a couple that might be quite relevant, I guess, is that alcohol's been identified as one of the top 3 most common causes as to why older generations might fall over. It can adversely affect or react with them any medication that they're taking. And of course, the older we get, the more ailments that we have, unfortunately. And so therefore we'll be having medication. And I think it's probably quite well known by now, but of course alcohol can really increase the risk of heart disease, having strokes, And in terms of vulnerable adults, they're also more prone to perhaps self-neglect, poor nutrition, poor hygiene. And so that's just a sort of a real brief snapshot in terms of vulnerable adults.
Mm. And and there are probably also quite a few connections with other safeguarding topics. For example, situations of domestic abuse. What are some of the kind of, I suppose, the safeguarding concerns with alcoholism and other areas such as domestic abuse?
Yes, so there's been numerous studies over the years in terms of the connection between alcohol and domestic abuse, or even just the connection between alcohol and violence. And there's a training provider called Straight A, and they've quoted that a figure of 87% of all domestic violence incidents begin with drinking. Um,
Mm,
Another study found that couples who had reported intimate partner violence, 30% of them said that alcohol was involved. And those that had said that there was severe intimate partner violence, they were more than twice as likely to report alcohol involvement. But to be really clear on alcohol and domestic abuse, alcohol does not and cannot make a person abuse another, and yet frequently it's used as an excuse.
mm,
And many people drink and they don't abuse their partner, and likewise, many people might abuse their partner but are sober.
mm, mm. And and there's also I suppose, the areas around parents and carers as well, and sort of children growing up and being brought up in the context of alcohol and substance abuse. Are you okay, maybe just to kind of highlight some kind of safeguarding concerns around that particular topic as well?
Yeah, so very briefly, parents and carers who misuse alcohol typically can have very chaotic, unpredictable lifestyles, and they struggle with recognizing what their child's needs are and to actually be able to meet those needs. And there's a lot of information that suggests that parents or carers that are misusing alcohol, it can lead to physical abuse against the child, neglect, poor physical and mental health in children as well. But on top of that, children are more likely to have low attainment levels, and there's a potential for involvement in antisocial or criminal behaviour as well.
Okay, so in summation, actually this is a topic which affects quite a lot of other safeguarding areas in terms of sort of, I suppose, a cross section. It kind of exemplifies situations as well. So it's definitely something that we need to make sure that we are aware of and are looking out for, I suppose, in the context of our churches. We are going to pause it there because we've got an interview with Kate from Alcoholics Anonymous. So Becky and I will kind of join back in a kind of conversation, but we're just about to go and listen to an interview with Kate. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Becky and I are privileged to be joined by Kate, who is from an organisation called Alcoholics Anonymous. Kate, thanks so much for joining us on the first ever of our Safeguarding podcast. Thanks for being a guest on the show and for gracing us with your presence. Yeah, so Kate, you're from Alcoholics Anonymous. So if people are listening and they might have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, or they might, this actually might be a new organization, kind of people listening, would you mind just kind of maybe giving us a bit of a flavor and maybe a bit of an introduction to the work that Alcoholics Anonymous does?
Certainly, yeah. So Alcoholics Anonymous is what we would call a mutual aid fellowship. It was founded in the 1930s in America, in Akron, and it grew throughout the world. And what we do is it's completely free to anyone who thinks that they have a problem with alcohol, and other people that have that problem get together. You talk about your experience with alcohol, what's helped you stay away from alcohol. You work through the 12 steps of the fellowship, and yes, sort of help each other to recover and stay away from alcoholism, away from alcohol.
Nice. And you just off air, as we were kind of talking a bit about sort of this as a particular topic, you mentioned statistics. I think actually will be really helpful for people, our listeners, to kind of hear. Would you mind just kind of sharing a bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So alcoholism isn't a niche issue. 1 in 20 people have an alcohol use dependency issue. So everybody knows an alcoholic. So it's quite a big issue in society, and it's something that people shy away from talking about. There's big taboos about being an alcoholic, and I think that's mostly attached to the behaviours that people display when they're suffering active alcoholism. But it's actually an illness like lots of other illnesses with cures and resources available to help people stay away from alcohol or to reduce their alcohol intake. So yeah, it's an issue and something that we should be able to talk more freely about.
And I think that statistic, listening to that, it's something I have never quite thought about, because I think probably in my own ignorance, kind of, almost was like, well, not necessarily everyone has walked alongside someone that is kind of struggling with alcoholism, and I think that's probably where you're talking about. There's that shame and that stigma that is attached to this, that maybe people don't necessarily talk about it, in the sense that actually people might not know that they are walking alongside someone, that there is someone in their sphere of influence, that they rub shoulders with, in the churches they go to, that this is a very real struggle for people that they might know. And maybe if you could maybe let listeners, almost, if someone listening to this and is hearing this statistic, and they are kind of almost, someone comes to mind in their head, actually, now that you mention it, maybe this person or this person, what are some of the signs that someone is maybe struggling with alcoholism, and might not necessarily be talking about it? What's some of the signs that this might be a struggle for them?
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult to tell. There are a lot of people that drink heavily that aren't alcoholics. There are a lot of people that appear to not drink too much who are alcoholic. The obvious one is excessive drinking, excessive hangovers. When drinking becomes, when you could become less careful about other aspects of your life, your job, your family, your finances, due to alcohol, you start becoming not as reliable as you used to be, not taking care of your personal well-being, your health. You can see the deterioration over a period of time. It's very difficult to tell in young people. I mean, I was alcoholic from the first time I had a drink in my late teens, but you could put it down to life stage. Drinking, young people drink a lot, but I was drinking excessively. I was always the most drunk person, always wanting to have a drink again, and it's things like drinking earlier in the day, and also signs like normal drinkers don't end up in hospital due to excessive. That hardly ever happens to a normal drinker. You don't, and that happened to me. You don't end up being arrested for things you've done when you're drinking as a normal drinker generally, or lose jobs because of drinking, lose relationships. So it's when alcohol is having a really negative impact on your life, but you don't see it, or you're refusing to see it, and you're actually just putting alcohol before all those other things that at certain stages of your life you should be concentrating more on, like friends, family, career, things like that.
And so, say for example, actually, there's some people maybe people are coming to mind, people in churches are maybe coming to mind, and then maybe realizing that maybe these people in particular haven't necessarily talked about this as a kind of as a topic, as something that they are struggling with, something they're journeying through. Maybe as it is, as you said, these people aren't necessarily going on a journey of admitting that to themselves, that it is a problem. How can people around, maybe in a congregation context, in a friends, family, how can people help? What's some of the things that people could do if they spot some of this?
Yeah, so we're all about planting the seed, and it's so difficult. It is really, I mean, I struggle. I'm a sober alcoholic. I've been in the fellowship for 8 years. I would still struggle to talk to people because it is this taboo subject. I would love to get to a stage where, and they are in some countries, I think they're a lot more open about alcoholism and support, in America, for example. But it should be, if you find a lump on your body, your friends and family will tell you to get that checked out by a doctor. But if you're drinking excessively and your life is deteriorating before everybody's eyes, people still are very, very shy about talking to you about alcoholism. So until we get to a stage where we can talk completely freely and openly, I would say remove the word alcoholism, because that has that negative connotation, and you might actually get not as good a reaction from somebody if you approach them with, perhaps you're an alcoholic. But we should be able to say to people, are you worried about your drinking? Because the chances are, even though an alcoholic doesn't appear to be concerned about their drinking, they are. I was, in the 12 or so years that I drank alcoholically, nobody was more concerned than me, but yet nobody really spoke to me about it. They very shy of the subject, when actually things are quite obvious. So you could ask people if they're concerned about their drinking, or if that you can and there's so many there's a lot of lists out there. We have them on the AA website, they're on a lot of other websites. You could refer people to the list to say that if you are worried about your drinking, there are checklists that you can go down to see if some of the other sort of organisations would agree that that you should start to think about your drinking, and whether there's anything you should do to sort of reduce it, or even stop drinking altogether. And ultimately, you should point them towards the services that can support them. In AA, the phenomenon of AA is that if you get a load of people together that couldn't stop drinking, somehow they managed to stop drinking. And I think what the founders sort of discovered back in the 1930s was that one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic somehow manages to get both of them to stop drinking. So my big thing is always to try and get an alcoholic, a drinking alcoholic, to talk to a sober alcoholic, because that sober alcoholic will really understand what that person's going through. And there are things that you can say to another alcoholic that perhaps people that haven't been on that journey wouldn't understand. So the conversation, I definitely understand it's difficult to start, but if you sort of ask people how they're feeling, and the chances are even if at that moment you don't get the reaction that you're expecting, yes, I'm an alcoholic, yes, I've been worried about it for ages, you planted that seed, and it's just implanting that seed. The average age of people getting support for alcoholism is fairly late, 40s and 50s. By that time, a lot of people have got broken careers, broken families, their own health has deteriorated significantly. So I suppose my big desire is if we can get people to come into the fellowship a little earlier, and people do come in their late teens and early 20s, and I think that's terrific, because then they're going to have a much better sober life. If they're an alcoholic, they'll have a much better life being sober than they would ever have while they're drinking. But we have people coming in the doors at every stage of life, and at every point. So at every point somebody comes into the fellowship, they're going to have better days ahead. So I think it's sort of changing the mindset from like you're shoehorning somebody towards something that is going to be actually quite negative for them, and actually by being brave and talking to somebody about their drinking, you're giving them the opportunity to have a much better life. And it doesn't matter how long that life is going to be. It's a gift. Sobriety is a gift when you're an alcoholic, because everything before that is chaos, and it's bad for your mental health, your physical health, your life. So being brave and taking that step to encourage somebody to get help with their drinking is a real gift to them.
So, I mean, Kate, you mentioned sort of starting really the conversations by removing that word alcoholism. And in our churches, when we do our training sessions on safeguarding, we're quite mindful, or we consider at least the language that we use about certain safeguarding themes and topics. So is there anything else? Have you got any other kind of tips on perhaps language to use or not to use?
Yeah, well, we shy away from feeling sorry for people, because I think that sort of gets people's backs up, and we say it's sort of particular to alcoholics, but we can be fairly prickly, especially when we spent a lot of years in active alcoholism. So it's really not patronizing the person. Try not to use the word alcoholic, and also presenting it to people as a choice, a positive choice that they can make for their life. Because that's the thing, when you choose to stop drinking or reduce your drinking, it's not something that's being thrust upon you. It's got to be a choice that you make for yourself. And any alcoholic, I could walk down the street any day. I pass pubs and off licenses, but I've made that positive choice for my life. So I guess it's presenting options, but not sort of shoehorning somebody into a decision.
And so, Kate, you mentioned right at the start about the 12 steps program. Are you able to give us a bit more of an insight as to what that actually involves for people?
Yeah, sure. So AA didn't create the 12-step program. That came from a fellowship that was in existence before the 1930s, but we have adopted it, and lots of other fellowships do. As people might be aware, the first step is admitting that you're powerless over alcohol and your life has become unmanageable, which is the hardest one. It's by far the hardest, because you have to realise that for yourself, and you think that alcohol is your only friend in the world, and then you realise you have to give it up. So that's the most important one. And then it's a bit of a journey, and it's actually a journey that everyone should go on. Only the first step mentions alcohol. All the rest of them are about looking at yourself, looking at your defects of character. That's not to be too hard on yourself, but it's interesting to see what you think about yourself, and sharing that with another human being. And then we look at people that we might have been affected by our alcoholism, and then make amends to them if it's safe to do so. And that's apologising to parents and family members sometimes, and it's tough, but it's a necessary step to sort of draw a line under things in the past. And then a lot of it is handing this stuff over, and sort of moving on with your life, and then sort of ending on carrying that message to other suffering alcoholics, which is the big driver of AA, is that as soon as you're in the door and sorted out, really you've got to focus on the people coming through.
And I mean, you mentioned about parents and families, and of course with alcoholism there is that ripple effect, that it's not just one person that it can impact. It can have much wider reaching arms, I guess. So is there any support services that you're aware of in terms of those families and friends that watch somebody who's suffering?
There absolutely is. Yeah, we have a sister organisation, Al-Anon, for the family and loved ones of alcoholics. They do great work. Sometimes alcoholics, AA members are in Al-Anon as well, if alcoholism has been prevalent in the family, and yeah, they work with the people that have been affected by that person's drinking, and they're an amazing organisation, and available to anyone. You don't have to be a spouse or a child. If you love someone who's suffering from alcoholism, or suffered, it can be past tense as well. Al-Anon is available for you.
That sounds fantastic. And this might be a bit more of a tricky sort of question to answer, really, and I don't know whether or not you'd know, but in terms of, I guess the question really is do you think in family relations, is there a cycle of alcohol? So could potentially children and young people then go on to have the same suffering as well?
Yeah, it's not something we get involved with too much in AA. I know there are a lot of learned people looking into the the physical causes, and there does seem to be some sort of genetic link. And you hear it all the times in the room. People that are children of alcoholics. It's not my experience. You can be an alcoholic from as a child of normal drinkers, but you do hear it a lot. Whether it's attached to genes or whether it's because of the experiences that the child went through in their formative years, who knows, but some people it is in their family and some people it isn't, so it's really difficult to say.
Yeah, and it's definitely a growing area of research, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about sort of, in almost this we don't really talk about it as, in our conversations, and I suppose I'm just thinking, is there something that we could do in our day-to-day lives to make sure that actually we're not necessarily we're not being reactive, we're actually being proactive in changing a bit of culture and conversation around this particular topic? How best could we start to see a bit of a culture change in how we talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's big because the media often portrays alcoholics as always likely to drink again. You can see it in TV programs. So I think there'll be it's quite a big job to shift people's perceptions. Because actually, the survival rates and the recovery rates of alcoholics is really good. If you get to 5 years sober, you're 80% more likely to spend the rest of your life sober. So, and that's great. And so changing the shift, I mean, the shift has to come from us alcoholics as well. That I'm not shy about telling people that I'm an alcoholic. We see it as an allergy. It's not a technical, in the medical definitions, but it is to us in the fact that when I have one drink of alcohol, I cannot stop myself. I don't know what it feels like to have had enough alcohol. In that respect, it's a bit like an allergy, and that's the thing. It's treating it like an illness. And that's one of the big things you realize when you come into AA and other fellowships, is that you weren't a bad person. You weren't all the things you did. You have to account for the things that you did and take responsibility for them. But you're actually a sick person getting well, not a bad person getting good. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand, and I don't understand. I totally get it. If I see people gambling too excessively, I don't understand what that feels like. And yet to watch an alcoholic drinking excessively, it must be very strange for people that aren't alcoholic to think, why don't they just stop drinking? But I think everybody has their thing, like whether it's crisps, whether it's a TV show. But I think it's really understanding, and it's hard because sometimes you're talking to the children of alcoholics and they've had a really tough time because of their alcoholic parent or somebody in their life, husbands and wives, but some of these people they get to a place where they understand that alcoholism is cunning and baffling. It's an illness that tells you you haven't got it and you have to self-diagnose. And only 1% of alcoholics ever come into AA. So we've got 206 million alcoholics in the world, 2 million alcoholics in AA. If you think about it, 99% of alcoholics are out there drinking, living alcoholic lives, dying alcoholic deaths. That's the life that you're supposed to have when you develop alcoholism. So for most people, it just doesn't make any sense. So I suppose the big thing that we sort of encourage is a bit of understanding. Nobody chooses to be an alcoholic. Nobody would choose that life for themselves. Why would I, as a young woman, did I want to drink myself into oblivion and squander so many chances in my life? And I was really lucky. I came into the fellowship at 30, so a lot of my life, hopefully, to live soberly. But yeah, just compassion, I guess, towards alcoholism and alcoholics. You can't understand it, but it's a real thing, and it's as baffling to the person suffering as it is to the person watching.
And I just wonder, I wonder actually, in terms of coming into kind of close, I suppose, if there is, for our listeners, as I suppose, any sort of stories of hope, or actually that journey, if you will, of people that have, you know, if you're able to share some form of story of hope, or something where actually people have sought that right help, they've journeyed it through, and they've gone on to live that kind of that sober life.
Oh my goodness. I mean, that's what AA is. AA is stories. It's alcoholics talking to one another about what it was like and what it's like now. I've got dear friends in AA, professionals. I mean, if you went into an AA meeting, and there are open AA meetings, and I would encourage anyone interested in this field to go to an open AA meeting, and you'll meet vicars and doctors, and just such a broad spectrum of society, and everyone's got their stories to tell. Doctors who are nearly struck off, and grandparents that they might have been in active alcoholism while their children were being brought up, but somehow the families have repaired, and now their children are allowing them to see their grandchildren. And from my perspective, it was, I've got a little sister who I love with all my heart, and I was not a good sister to her whole life, and she got married a few years ago, and I was sober, and I was with her all day, all night. I went to bed that night, and I hadn't done anything to ruin her wedding day. I hadn't got too drunk. I hadn't embarrassed us and the family. And it's just those sorts of moments that when you're an alcoholic, you're such a risk to your family and your friends and your loved ones. And that, and I suppose, yeah, the best rewards of sobriety, or tackling your drinking, are the ones that involve your family and friends, and the moments that you could be there. Good moments and bad moments, because obviously we've got people in the fellowship who were able to be with their parents or other loved ones who have passed away in their final moments, when that might not have been possible while they were drinking. So just to be present with your family and friends, they're the ones that stand out for me.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. That was just so informative, and it's just great to hear from someone who has journeyed through it, is journeying through it. And I just love those stories of hope, of the opportunity to enable people to be present with friends and family, and that is it's wonderful to hear of those stories as well, of people on that journey. So thank you ever so much, Kate, for joining us, for allowing us to have this conversation. It's been so good. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I thought that was such a great overview of some of the stuff. It's such a great conversation. There's so many gems in that for me. I think the sort of the first thing that really kind of struck me was when we were starting out in that conversation, and Kate was talking about, actually this is something that affects a lot of people, and I just, in my ignorance, I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know anyone, and now I'm sitting there thinking, it's probably quite likely that I do.
Yeah.
and I think for quite a lot of people, maybe it's that shame and that stigma, but that we distance ourselves from this topic,
Yeah.
when I think it is something that we should be talking about a lot more. And and in a way that doesn't have a shame attached to it, that there is an openness there. And I think it's really important for us to, you know, almost, it's because of the number of people that are probably struggling with some aspect of this, is to know, to be able to have those conversations in our churches, not only just because we want to love our communities well, but this isn't something that is necessarily going on just outside the walls of our church contexts. This is something that also, it, you know, people could be struggling within the walls of the church. It's not just, it's something that can affect anyone. And I think for me, my kind of takeaway is actually just to be open with having a conversation about our own relationship with alcohol, and being open about, you know, having a conversation around that. I think that's something that I feel like I've kind of taken away sort of from that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have quite a few conversations with different churches about lots of different safeguarding issues. And the key thing is, for me, I think generally about being more open and transparent and engaging in those conversations, because the more we talk about things, the more it opens up that door for people to feel safer to perhaps raise their hand and say, well, this is happening to me, and I need support. So definitely we need to be having those conversations. And something else that Kate had said in terms of the language that we use as well, this is a conversation that we frequently have in our training sessions. Language is such an important aspect of how we talk to people, engage with them, and it can really, I think, make or break people either accessing support, or how they perceive the response that a church can give.
And what would you say, you know, say for example there are church ministers, presbyters, lay people listening to this podcast. I suppose in some of that, like what are some of the steps, do you think, that churches can take to help churches become safer around some of the stuff we've talked about today?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the obviously the key thing, as we just said, is about engaging in that conversation, and how we react to somebody that might be seeking help is going to be really important in terms of our body language, what we're communicating verbally to people as well. So ultimately, the very first key step is to have that conversation and have it in a non-judgmental way. And churches really need to, I think, sort of open their eyes, and see that perhaps this is an aspect that might be affecting somebody, and to take steps at a really early stage, and perhaps consider that it may not be just that one particular person that's affected, but what is that ripple effect that we spoke about earlier? Where do those arms reach out to? Who else is it impacting? So, for example, does the person have a partner that's sitting at home? Do they have children that might be affected? And what is that impact on them? So it's about asking those questions as well. And by looking at things at a real early stage, if need be, referrals can be made, whether or not that's for early help to social care, or even just supporting conversations that people might need to have with their GP, at their doctors. It's really just sort of about supporting them, and signposting them to the best supporting services for that person and the family.
Yeah, and I think it's probably, we're just worth saying for everyone listening on the podcast that we will be putting out, along with this podcast, a sort of list of some local services that people can kind of access for support, and especially some of the stuff that Kate mentioned as well earlier on. We'll be putting some of that stuff out along with this podcast, that if you do know someone, or you yourself have recognized that during this, you know, that's something you struggle with and you want to seek out help, the sort of different organizations that that can sort of provide help will be out there as well. But thanks ever so much, everyone, for listening. Thanks for listening to our first podcast. There will be more coming out across this year, but hopefully that's been helpful in introducing you to this particular area of safeguarding, and that hopefully gives a bit of food for thought of how to continue on the conversation. But so it's a goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from me. Thank you everyone for listening.